Get everybody in here.
Bruce, congratulations on the new family member.
Oh, thanks a lot. Yeah. Yes, the littlest globalista.
Grandpa Sterling.
Aww.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frida Reeve, the Italian, Serbian, Spanish child.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, good evening, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to this Anderson's Bookshop virtual author event with Cory Doctorow. We're so glad to have you with us this evening. As a reminder, please leave your video and your audio off so that we can focus on our presenters this evening. Thank you for taking the time to keep your eyes on yet another screen from, one second here, sorry. Yet another screen. I know everybody's spending a lot of time on them now, but Anderson's is an independent bookstore outside Chicago, for those of you who are not familiar. And we've been owned and run by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations. So your support is very personal to us, especially during these crazy times. So we'd just like to take a minute to say thank you for that. We really do appreciate it. And your support and your purchase ensures that we'll still be here after this has all ended. Feels like the wrong word nowadays, but has mostly passed. Maybe that's a little more accurate. But as I'm reminded, transitioned. Oh, I like it. As I'm reminded, our business has survived the first flu pandemic, or the most recent one in 1918. So we feel like we'll survive this pandemic as well. So your support will help. Normally, we'd be having this in person and welcoming Cory back to our location in person, along with 400 other events a year. But we're hoping that this virtual style keeps us all tied over until we can be together in person again, whenever that may be, when we've transitioned. Thank you, Cory. We do have other virtual events on our calendar coming up for all ages and interests. So be sure to check us out on our website or on our social media to find the next one that gets your interest. A couple things of note: we are having lunch with John Grisham next Monday, and an evening with Vivian Howard next week. And we're all going to learn how to make cocktails at home, because we will need it the week after the election with J.M. Hirsch. So a couple other things coming up, just want to let you guys know about. But tonight, we are very happy to welcome Cory back to Anderson's to celebrate the launch of his new book, A Tax Service. I will give you guys the official Cory Doctorow bio so we can be all kinds of official tonight. Cory Doctorow is a novelist, a journalist, and an internationally known human rights activist. As a journalist, he's a regular contributor to The Guardian, Locus, and many other publications. As an activist, he is known for his critiques of copyright abuse, of technological monopolies and monopsonies, and of all uses of technology to build dystopian systems of unchallengeable privilege. His award-winning novel Little Brother was a New York Times bestseller, as was its sequel Homeland. His 2019 novella collection Radicalized is one of 5 finalists for 2020's CBC Canada Reads program. Congrats on that. Born and raised in Canada, he now lives with his family in Los Angeles. And I will let Cory introduce our friends with us this evening, Bruce and Chris.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very, very kind of you. It's lovely to be back at Anderson's. Anderson's played a big role in Little Brother. You were the ones who squired me around to the giant high schools of Chicagoland and got it in front of hundreds and hundreds of high schoolers the week it came out. It was transformative for the book. It put it on the IndieBound bestseller list, and that's what made the book a bestseller. So I owe a big debt to Anderson's. It's lovely to be back. My guests tonight with me for this Cyberpunk and post-Cyberpunk night are Bruce Sterling, who I asked for a bio. He very pithily described himself as an author, a critic, and a former cosmopolitan globalist. And Bruce has dragged his butt out of bed at 2 in the morning in Ibiza, Spain, for our event tonight. And sitting in the Airstream in Austin there is Christopher Brown, Campbell and World Fantasy Award nominated author of Tropic of Kansas, Rule of Capture, and Failed State. Superb books that were superbly timed. Now the plan tonight, there you go, that's the one. I'll do the same with Attack Surface here. Here we go.
There you go.
So the plan tonight is I'm going to read a brief passage from the book. It's like a 5-minute reading. That's kind of the cyberpunkish bit of the book that I thought would resonate with the folks there. Look at that. Bruce has got his copy. Nicely done. Thank you for sending that off to Bruce, Chris. Chris sent him in a care package. And then we're going to do some questions. I got a couple of questions in the can for Bruce and Chris, and then I'm hoping it'll rollick along. And then we'll take some questions from you. There's that little Q&A button down there, chat button down there. You can throw your questions in there, and we'll see where we get to. All right, so here's a reading from Attack Surface. It is a scene told from the point of view of Masha. She's the young woman who's the protagonist of this book. She is a surveillance contractor who sleeps at night by spending her days or her evenings teaching the people she spies on how to resist the surveillance that she installs for her paymasters every day. This is the kind of self-destructive thing that I think is emblematic of cyberpunk at its best, and it's a scene at a protest that she has helped to develop this surveillance for. The square was more crowded now. Barrel fires burned, and in their flickering light and the last purple of the sunset, I saw a lot of flimsy homemade armor. You guys are in so much trouble. Vi. I pointed at a young dude who was handing out painter's masks, because those masks don't do shit against tear gas or pepper spray. I know. She did fatalistic really well. Well? She shrugged in Boris. It makes them feel like they're doing something. Feeling isn't enough, I said. Maybe in the past, in the Václav Havel days or whatever, back then you had these basket case Borises who ran their secret police on vodka and purges and relied on their own engineering talent to make listening devices the size of refrigerators that needed hourly repairs and oil changes. Now spooks like Litvinchuk can fly to DC every couple of years for the Snoopers Ball trade show, where the best capitalized surveillance companies in the world lay out their wares for anyone to buy. Sure, they're all backdoored by the Russians, the Chinese, or the Americans, but they're still about 1,000,000 times better than anything Slovakia is going to produce on its own, and they will peel you and your friends like oranges. Not just surveillance either. You should see the brochures from the less lethals industry these days. Melt your face pain rays, pepper spray and nerve gas aerostats, sound weapons that make you shit your pants. I know, you tell me this all the time. What do you want me to do? I try to be smarter. I try to make my friends smarter. But what can I do about all these people? I could feel the heat rising through my body. The fact that you don't have a solution doesn't mean that you don't need to find one, and it doesn't mean that one can't be found. You and your 7 friends aren't going to change shit. You need all these people, and you know something they don't, and until they know it, they're going to get creamed. My hands shook. I stuffed them in my pockets. I shook my head, cleared out the screams ringing in my ears, screams from another time and place. You need to be better because this is serious, and if you're not better, you'll die. You understand that? You can run from these jokers, hide with paranoid Android and Faraday pouches, but you will make mistakes and the computers they run on will catch those mistakes, and when they do, there was doner kebab coming up my gullet, and I couldn't talk anymore without puking or maybe sobbing, and I couldn't tell you which would be worse. I'm not an idiot. I was talking to myself more than I was talking to her. Having a day job where you help repressive regimes spy on their dissidents and a hobby where you help those dissidents evade detection is self-destructive. I get that. But tell me that you don't do anything self-contradictory. Tell me that you don't find yourself disassociating, doing something you know you'll regret later, something you know is wrong, and doing it anyway, like you're watching yourself do it. I just have a more dramatic version is all. Christina must have seen something in my face which I hated. It wasn't her business what was going on in the heart of my head. But she took me in a big hug, which Borises also specialize in. It was a good hug. I snuffled the snot back in, willed my tears away, and hugged her back. She was tiny underneath all those layers. It's okay, she said. We know you're only trying to keep us safe. We will do our best. Your best won't be good enough, I didn't say. I took her hand. Let's stroll. So that's the reading.
Bravo.
So thank you very much. It's great to you guys give good audience. It's nice to it's always weird reading into the camera when you can't see other people doing stuff and you're just kind of doing your thing and hoping that the camera hasn't in fact just cut out in the middle of the reading, and you'll look up. And I once saw Leo Kottke do a set where he described how he always looked down at his guitar, and one time he looked up and there was a thread of drool connecting his mouth to the 12th fret, and he'd been playing like 3 songs without noticing. It's kind of my failure mode that I worry about the most here.
Well, your accents are unstoppable. So.
I just channel my grandmother. So Bruce, I wanted to talk to you first as the cyberpunk on the panel. I think loosely you could call Chris and me post cyberpunks. I think you're probably post cyberpunk now, but I wanted to ask you about this idea that's often repeated, including by me, that cyberpunk was a warning and not a suggestion, because cyberpunk, for whatever else it was incredibly cool, and making something cool is by way of a suggestion. So was cyberpunk a suggestion?
How can I put this? It's a premonition and it's an extrapolation, but there's never just one, right? And I don't want to come off, as the Pope Emperor of some kind of flat pack future here, because I think it always works best when you do, wildly different things, like make the villain the good person, make the good person the villain, make a situation that seems good turn out to be bad, and so forth and so on. So, and the kind of evolution that went on there is like, okay, first we want to figure out what the heck is going on. And that's kind of easy to glamorize. It's like, okay, there's like stuff coming out of the lab. People don't have any words for it yet. It's all acronyms. So you can make up neologisms and you can invent people who would be using this stuff, and you can glamorize them and just sort of make them, cool electronic frontier console cowboy style characters. But, eventually a generation passes and then you're left with all this stuff that you predicted in the past. Like I used to glamorize fax machines quite a lot, right? And and thinking back on it, I'm not exactly nostalgic about it because I think nostalgia is a kind of moral poison. There's something wrong with it. But I derived a lot of personal benefit from fax as a technology that like nobody before my lifetime and nobody after my lifetime can ever really have. Like hacking and pranking fax machines was like super glamorous and fun,
Right.
and it was spreading every day, right? Because there'd be like new people. It's like, I've got one. Like, send me something, So we're sending all this punk, telephone pole, wheat starch style paper stuff because, fax is thermal paper, right? So, it was like the period equivalent of plotter art, and a lot of people have never heard of plotter art, but it was one of the big groundswells in early digital art, right? So you wouldn't say that you were suggesting a fax machine. It was more like you were engaged with the fax machine. So, having been a guy who glamorized fax machines and like persuaded every novelist I knew to get one, I'm now like concerned. It's like, okay, what's my moral relationship to this dead technology, right? I mean, what would I say about it now? And that's true of like all these things that we were predicting and extrapolating, right? It's like having an adult child who died, right? I mean, there's a kind of grief about it, but there's also like the lack of a summary for it, right? So, it's not just that you suggest it and that it becomes glamorous. I mean, young people are pretty. I mean, even a demon is pretty at 16, as the Japanese like to say, right? But nobody stays 16. They're 32, they're 48, right? Okay, science fiction's not used to writing about deglamorized 48-year-old technologies. Right? If you do nothing but suggest and you kind of never go there, it's a kind of emotional abandonment.
So I love that answer, and it tees up what I want to talk to Chris about next. Chris, so much of science fiction, cyberpunk rather, is about aesthetics as well as technology. I think Gibson called it the poetics of technology. And you have written this trilogy, this kind of ecological catastrophe trilogy that is extremely pastoral. So it contrasts these very technological, noir, literally, flaring oil derricks and blighted lands with this incredible lush pastoral description right out of John Muir or like a Kim Stanley Robinson novel. And you do this daily naturalist. I always forget which one is a nudist and which one is someone who likes nature, whichever the one who likes nature
Naturalist,
is.
I guess, yeah.
Naturalist. That you do these naturalist newsletters.
Not a lot of naturists here in Ibiza.
Yeah. But I wanted to know, like, how have you found a linkage between pastoralism, which I think in like the peak of cyberpunk was like the antithesis of cyberpunk, and cyberpunk itself, and that's recognizably the thing and its opposite.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I set out to write Tropic of Kansas, I was trying to write a very kind of post-cyberpunk novel about like democracy 3.0, about how people could use networks to create a more authentically participatory democracy. And to get there, I needed to have kind of conditions of revolution, and I started, imagining a kind of a darker mirror version of America. But as I dug into it and had these characters kind of walking through this landscape, you kind of realize it's kind of like in Blade Runner, like when they go to the countryside, it's like, wait, this supposedly ethereal technological realm that has been conjured, there's good reason to be suspicious of its seeming untethering from like the physical reality of the planet. And why is the sky the color of a television tuned to a dead channel, right? And that an idea that that part of the failure of cyberpunk and or the wizard technologist heroes of cyberpunk and carving out the liberated territory that cyberspace represents, and like kind of protecting it from its colonization by capital, is that they haven't solved the fundamental problems of how capital relates to the earth and to the land on which we live. And so I don't know, I think the two kind of go together, and it's like you can't really enjoy cyberspace when everything outside your room is burning, as is the case right now, right? So
I certainly gave it the old college try in the last month, and I think that having run the experiment, I'm going to side with you, Bruce. You touched on nostalgia there, and it struck me that there is a nostalgic form of cyberpunk today. Cyberpunk 2077 and so on. These are they're throwbacks, right? They're like happy days. And I wondered if you two could reflect on this idea that we are nostalgic for something, because, for all the technology, the cyberpunk was infused with an enormous amount of cool, it described a world that I think even by 2020 standards was not a great place that anyone would want to live in. So how is it that we're nostalgic for it?
Well, I used to live in India. So, and then this was like India in the 1970s. So, I wouldn't say that I'm nostalgic for like the absolute poverty and like rampant public disease that I used to see in like India in 1969 or 1970. But, compared to like downtown Madras in southern India in 1969, most cyberpunk novels are Switzerland. They're really sort of, amazing and fun, and I wouldn't call them like Brian Aldiss cozy catastrophes, but, from the point of view of cyberpunk novelists, most people in cyberpunk novels are having a pretty good time. I mean, they've got agency. There's usually some kind of romance going on. I mean, maybe the cops are after them, or maybe they are cops, but there's something of political import going on, and they're like committed and engaged, and they're not like all eaten up with anime or anything. They're not in states of major depression, and they don't nostalgize. I mean, there are characters in Gibson novels who do, and they usually like live in junk stores.
or an orbit.
Or an orbit that is a junk store. But Gibson used to work in junk stores. That was his day job early on. He's kind of a primitive eBay guy.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, the problem with nostalgia is that it's very treacherous, and you always end up, over sentimentalizing something that wasn't a big deal at the time. Like, the famous line about the sky being the color of television. Okay, the sky in Neuromancer is the color of an extinct analog television.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not the color of a modern television. I mean, we don't even have modern televisions. We got like Netflix and chill. right?
Charlie Strauss started a short story, I forget which one, with the sky over the port was the color of a channel, television tuned to a dead channel, a beautiful shade of blue.
Yeah.
You know, I
Well,
think,
it's a
and
good
very quickly it
opening
was
line. It's
outstripped.
like, it's like the opening line of Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. A screaming comes across the sky. So, it's easy to parody and to kind of turn into a meme. But when you first read it, it wasn't a meme. On the contrary, it felt sort of very vivid and engaging, and and emotionally compelling in a way that it is not in retrospect.
Right.
And being nostalgic about cyberpunk, it interests me to see a younger generation want to do this. It's like, oh, I romanticize 8-bit music, but if you're really into that, you're a steampunk. Because steampunk's got everything that cyberpunk nostalgia has, except on steroids and with better costumes.
Chris, there's something nostalgic about pastoralism, isn't there?
Well, yeah, I mean, any kind of pastoralism is infused with, the worst kind of nostalgia, which is romanticism in the kind of like German sense, nature worshiping sense. And we know where that goes. So you have to be absolutely wary of that. I mean, I'm trying to kind of completely turn it on its head with a kind of ugly, I was going to say uglified, it's just kind of reporting what I see, but an Anthropocene view on the landscape around us. And it's a landscape that's full of technology and full of the evidence of technological manipulation, both in the very immediate, present sense and in the kind of deeper historical sense.
There was a kind of evolution through cyberpunk about the crisis that it faced. There was, obviously corporatism was always in the background, but there were, the hints that there had been nuclear wars in the Neuromancer books and so on. Gibson said that he thought that Neuromancer was optimistic because it was set 30 years in the future and there had only been one limited nuclear exchange, Today, clearly the eschatology that we watch for is the climate emergency. Bruce, I know that it creeps into distraction and then shows up on, with a vengeance in the Caryatids. Where do you think cyberpunk fits with the climate emergency? How do they come together?
Well, it's one of our many cultural failures there. I've been writing about climate change ever since I first started writing science fiction, because, it was literally in the air and everybody knew it was coming. So to extrapolate about it and write scenarios about it happening did, as far as I can figure out, absolutely nothing to even slow it down. I mean, it just came on like a melting ice cap. And, it just started rising like rising seas. So, it's, and I've known people who are campaigners against climate change and, enviro people, and I was involved with them. I mean, not as involved as you are with electronic liberties activities, because nobody ever paid me for it. I didn't have a day job, but I knew kind of, I don't know. I mean, every tall grass detail about climate change, and practically everything that was being denounced as alarmism in the early 1980s is just an existence proof all around us. Right.
But the poetics of technology and the glamour and terror of the impending nuclear disaster and so on, is there an analog to that? I mean, we've got solar punk and we've got cli-fi and all of those things, but they don't seem to, they seem to have moved on, right? Is there a thread? Could you write cyberpunk about a climate emergency?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm still writing cyberpunk about a climate emergency. In fact, I'm about to write a story that's about a post-climate emergency where people have been in one for like 20 or 30 years. And, and nobody kind of blathers about it anymore. It's just kind of there. But, once you actually have a technological change which is on your doorstep, it's like, could you write a story about somebody's, tremendous excitement about getting their first personal computer? Like, okay, first of all, the computers we have now aren't personal. Second, they're not hugely exciting. They're not brought to you by, ragged hippie guys out of a garage in the valley. They're sold to you by the largest and most potent corporations in the world. So, you could strip your mind of all the assumptions and you could invent it again. Like you could write like an alternate world version in which there'd never been one and somebody discovers one. But, these are all kind of forced and peculiar. Whereas, in my daily reality, I'm here in central Ibiza, and just down the road is this extremely cyberpunk looking roadside attraction, which is an Ibiza biotechnology botanical garden. And it's very Christopher Brown in there, because it's like rich guys in Ibiza, sort of well-to-do left-wing green characters who've gone and they've collected all the rare plants they can find in Ibiza, and they're trying to like put them into a kind of ark, right? Well, I go down there and I hang out now, and I'm like in there like writing cyberpunk novels and having a beer with my mask on, right? But it's not like it's something that would have been a climate change trope in the 1980s, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the patriots on the island, they're trying to gather all the plants into a little ark, and automate everything, and they've got sensors on them so they don't die, and little sunshades and sprinklers. Okay, I'm very taken with that place, but it's super real. And when you go there, they don't talk about being cyberpunk. They talk about whether they can make a budget without any tourist traffic, right? Because, the pandemic killing off the people who are supposed to be paying for the attractions of looking at all these little rare cacti. So yeah, I could write some science fiction about them, but instead I just go in and like pay full price for a ticket and try and give them some beer money. And I go to their public events where they do stuff like, reveal books about the local lizards. So I went and reviewed one of their lizard books, but, it's like being your character Masha and hanging out with these left-wing guys in the imaginary show Stakia. So you could say, how can you island people think you're going to ever protect your plants? Don't you realize that like your island's going to go underwater and the temperature is going to soar? And even if you get your tourists back, the tourists are going to trample all the rare plants and so forth, but they have the same kind of, well, we must do something,
right?
Kind of attitude that activists always have. And there they are, as an existence proof. So, it's kind of hard for me to glamorize them, even though I would imagine things like that happening. And I'm not even sure they can stay alive, but, that might be a little bit cynical. It might be that, in fact, in 5 or 6 years, they've got all kinds of European Union funding and they might be a really big deal, right? I mean, they might be bigger than the Ford Foundation, or maybe some mogul like Jeff Bezos would take an interest and suddenly drop a ton of long now money on them. And then they suddenly have like laser drilled, super green, whatever, right? I mean, writing them off would be a mistake. And they interest me a lot, right? But they're not solar punk. You don't go there and they're not, they are much more of a blood and soil, Southern Spanish kind of, regionalists. I mean, they're Balearic regionalists. It's like, this is our heritage. What would great grandfather say if we allowed the glasswork to go extinct? Right. Yeah.
Wow. And Chris, what do you think the relationship is there? What do you think that a cyberpunk climate fiction is? I mean, that seems to be what you're writing.
I think Bruce's Heavy Weather is a kind of a cyberpunk novel about climate change.
That's a good point.
I think it's harder. I mean, what you guys were talking about earlier about what's the appeal of kind of classic cyberpunk? Why do we have, this resurgence of interest in like generating new kind of takes on a sort of 80s style cyberpunk? And I think part of it, that idea of agency over the kind of tools that give you control over life in a world where people feel very at sea in terms of their ability to kind of even get a handle on what's going on in their immediate reality. There's an attraction to that. In the context of classic cyberpunk, it's about controlling these human created, communications networks, right? You could do the same thing with climate stories, but the kind of cyberpunk approach, narrative approach, would be to give you agency over the climate, I guess, over these much more impersonal forces that are kind of a lot harder to write about because they don't have as much human agency to imbue them with from a kind of narrative standpoint. So it's trickier unless you're like, writing about trees as characters is really hard unless you're like Ursula K. Le Guin or Richard Powers, right? But you think of like a Monkey Wrench Gang, the Edward Abbey story. I mean, that's kind of cyberpunk in attitude, right? And you could certainly write a science fictional Monkey Wrench Gang that takes place in the right now or the day after tomorrow or in Cyberpunk 2077. And I think there's cool material there. And yeah, I'm trying to play with some of the same kind of material. I hadn't really thought about it from that angle, but it sort of inheres in, the stuff I'm bringing with me as a reader and a writer. And I think back to the question about romanticism, one of the things that gives cyberpunk its power to me is also its fresh take on how to use language and literary style and the kind of the jazz, and there particularly like the kind of sonic jazz of talking about technology in the context of kind of, the great kind of classic works of cyberpunk, but just taking that approach of the writers of the new wave that's like stylistically fearless, but then giving it enough like narrative, like coherency that you can actually read it and build an entire novel on it. I think those toolkits work really well in the context of writing about nature and the environment. You just have to do that same kind of inversion of it. It's not about the pretty, perfect landscape. It's about the degraded, Anthropocene landscape, and like, let's go in there and see what there is to report.
So I've been working on this utopian climate emergency novel called The Lost Cause that's set after a Green New Deal, and it's indistinguishable from a dystopian climate emergency novel except for the posture of the characters. So, everything's on fire, everyone is sick, there are vast quantities of people who have lost their homes and so on. And what they've done is oriented their economy and their species around a 300-year project to do things like move all the coastal cities 20 kilometers inland and build the structures that you need to take care of just huge hundreds of millions of traumatized people and so on. And they call themselves the first generation in a century that doesn't fear the future. That's what they reassure themselves they are.
Right on.
And one thing about this book is that it is not punk at all. I keep trying to make it more punk, and there's no punk to be had in this because there's no nihilism and there's no cynicism. There's no room for it in that story. People are angry and they're at odds with one another. And, the main story problem is truth and reconciliation with white nationalists who think that they're in a dystopia. And are monkey wrenching things and, blowing shit up and getting material support from a flotilla of Ayn Randites who live on aircraft carriers moored to the high ground in the Grand Caymans, which they've declared to be a sovereign territory.
Nice.
And I can't find any punk in there, even with this Neil Stevensonian flotilla. I can't find any punk in there. Is there any punk left in 2020, or is it just Johnny Lydon in a MAGA shirt?
Oh, there's tons of counterculture people in Ibiza.
But is it punk?
Well, it depends on what you think a counterculture is and what a bohemia is. But punk is just a particular name for this kind of culture clash by means other than war kind of situation. But there are lots of situations where there's no punk for a while. Like if you're in the siege of Paris and the Franco-Prussian War, even though the place is full of long-haired bohemian dropouts and painters and musicians and so forth. There's no counterculture activity because everybody's just getting blown up and starved. You know, there's not a lot of, you know, dropouts in the siege of Leningrad. There's not a lot of countercultural activity during a major epidemic. You know, in World War II, all the science fiction writers were working in aviation assembly plants. There weren't any pulp magazines. There was no fandom during World War II. You know.
I thought L. Ron Hubbard spent the war.
You're trying to get like hung up on like making particular kinds of countercultural head fakes. It's like, okay, the guys down at the local high-tech botanical garden here, they're characters who could easily be in a cyberpunk novel, but they're neither cyber nor punks. I mean, they really are, you know, regional preservation guys with like a minor in doing like ecotourism. So, you know, I would not be afraid of that. And also I would say that, you know, if you can't write anything that isn't punk, you're a hick, right?
Oh, come on.
Or you're 17 years old. I mean, you just don't know
Right.
very much, right? I mean, if you think that the bohemian attitudes are like the be all and end all of human culture, you don't know very much, right? And you know, I mean, that's a very teenage attitude. It's like my parents know nothing, but the guy who's in my favorite rock band knows everything. It's like, no, he doesn't. Okay. So, you know, you shouldn't go around trying to force stuff into that. It's like trying to write a story where you're driven to put in 1920s radio crooners. Because you really like Bing Crosby. It's like, there's no room for Bing Crosby in my narrative. Okay, leave Bing Crosby out.
More megaphones. Chris, you were trying to get in there.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I feel like the punk protagonist, at least the cyberpunk protagonist, tends to be a loner, at least in my reading. And I think it's okay to also have stories about communities of people trying to solve problems. If you think about like true punk scenes, they were kind of in a way all about being part of a community that also allowed, you know, people to express themselves in terms of their iconoclastic individualism. And if you think about, I don't know, the American punk scenes of the 80s, like the hardcore scene, I mean, that I was somewhat involved with, and I had family members and, you know, bands and stuff. And that was all about a kind of community, but also was not a very inclusive community. They all kind of looked like, you know, skinny little white guys with short hair. And I think if you can build more inclusive, like models of community that still have that kind of punk ethos of being unafraid to, take down whatever the establishment problems are, I think you might be onto something. So I don't know. I think it can be pretty punk to try to maybe utopianism is what's the really punk thing to do now, to try to like actually have the balls or cojones or gumption or whatever less gendered term you want to use for it, to try to tackle real problems. And to your point, like not be afraid of the future, right? And or to try to like, okay, what would it take to actually like start building a future we would actually want to live in? I think that's, I don't know how punk that is, but I think it's a worthy undertaking.
Yeah, Bruce, you reminded me of your parenting advice when I became a dad, where you said that no matter how cool and bohemian I was, that by the time my daughter was 15, I would epitomize contemptible bourgeois normalcy to her. And she broke her wrist last week and she won't let me sign her cast. So I think we're there.
Yeah, well, it didn't take Nostradamus to figure that one out, Dad.
All right, so last question before we get into the Q&A here. What is cyberpunk? What cyberpunk gadgets have you seen in 2020? So I'll kick it off here. Medtronic is the world's largest ventilator manufacturer. They make the workhorse ventilators. They started as an independent repair company, and now they're one of the primary lobbyists against right to repair. And they've rigged their ventilators so you can't repair them without reactivating them with an unlock code. There's DRM in them. And there's a Polish technician who got his Medtronic certification, but never went to work for them, but he kept all the gear. and he started to make unlock devices where he's burning whatever it is that generates these unlock codes onto like FPGAs or EEPROMs or something, and putting them in old guitar pedals and clock radios and mailing them to hospital technicians around the world so they can fix their ventilators during the plague. And I was like, that's pretty cyberpunk for 2020. Do you guys have anything that you've seen that you would call 2020 cyberpunk?
I think we're on it right now, aren't we? Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah,
Sorry.
pretty much. Yeah, Zoom is rather cyberpunk because it kind of came out of nowhere. I'm liking TikTok, because TikTok's Chinese and like everybody's fearful and hateful of it, but the people who are actually using TikTok are like very young and doing peculiar things. But, in terms of like the old 1970s do-it-yourself punk ethos, I mean, the children of that are, anything that's connected to the Arduino ecosystem, right? Yeah. And in Torino, where I'm traveling today, like I'm on a travel day today. There's a network of fab labs, and there's all this kind of homemade hardware and all kinds of open source gear, 3D printable stuff, and it's an entire alternate production system, which is very, very punk. I mean, it's cyber and it's also punk because it's like not dominated mostly by money, and there's like tons of shareable stuff, and it's like put together by hobbyists who are doing it kind of one at a time and so forth. And I don't romanticize it, even though I'm super supportive of it and know a ton of people in it, and I'm always interested in it. Enzo Mari died yesterday. He was a very great Italian designer who did a whole series of do-it-yourself furniture in the 1970s, and he has a legacy of this kind of alternate bohemian dropout resistance technology. And I've actually built some of this stuff, and I've been known to use Enzo Mari future furniture. There's some of it down at the Fab Lab, and it has its merits, but I mean, I live with the Yasmina of Casa Yasmina. We actually built this house, and we were using all these open source devices and really trying to live the life. And writing about it and doing it are two very different things. I mean, really, it's like imagining having a child and actually raising a child.
I don't know if can you guys hear me? No.
Yeah, we can hear you. Your video's frozen.
You look more punk when your video's frozen, by the way.
Excellent. Well, I'm having a very punk moment because my power has just gone out to my laptop and it's warning me that it's running out of juice. So I'm switching to my.
Hey, well, here's my very punk MacBook plug here, which is like literally held together with Gorilla Glue duct tape.
All right, let me see if I can get on that. Let me see if I can get on a new camera here.
Let me speak to your last question. I was thinking about my son and daughter-in-law live in Korea, and I was thinking about some of the things they're artists, and they've been playing around with like things you can do with the coronavirus COVID-19 exposure maps. But the most punk thing they've done with that is my daughter-in-law wears a mask under her mask, and like some kind of like she'll wear like a Groucho mustache with like sprinkles in it, and have a friend video her on live Instagram or on TikTok, sort of nonchalantly taking off her N95 mask to reveal some other even more insane mask in some public place. It's not sort of technologically intrinsically cyberpunk, but it's a pretty punk use of cyberpunk technologies, I think.
I think that's the street finding its own use for things. You guys got my audio again? My bad?
Yeah, and we were coming through loud and clear, and we can see you well.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but I'll have to figure that out later.
I've got one more product demo. It's kind of more Ballardian than punk, but this is an electric fly swatter. And you like press the button here and your green light comes on. And then you just sort of wave it through the air and it electrocutes any insect that's in midair, right? So
all the cool kids have one.
Yeah, well, here in Ibiza, we had a huge plague of mosquitoes this summer because there was no tourist traffic and a lot of people up in the hills just sort of abandoned their swimming pools, which immediately began breeding these Ibiza mosquitoes in fantastic numbers. So these Ballardian undrained swimming pools were just disgorging this horde of flesh-eating pests. So, we're in here and we're like waving them in midair. You can sort of hear them whine. And every once in a while, you'll like hear a pop and they'd like be stuck and electrocuted onto this grid wire.
We have a house full of those here because we've got new invasive ones. We got the ankle biters that bring the West Nile. So we've got a lot of skeeters here. So I want to get into a couple of the Q&A cues here. Sandra Maltz got him really early and wanted us to recommend underrated science fiction. I'm going to say Leonard Richardson, who's the most underrated science fiction writer you've never heard of. He's a free software hacker, radical librarian, and he did one novel called Constellation Games. That's a spectacular debut novel set in Austin. It's about Austin bad app developers who do shovelware for Brazilian teen girls about ponies who end up in the middle of an alien invasion. It's a wonderful madcap book. He's got another one coming out in December. Leonard Richardson, published by Candlemark and Gleam, a publisher that, as far as I can tell, has only ever published one book by him. Very good writer. Any underrated favorites, guys?
Well, I'm kind of a George R. Stewart fan. If you want to read a novel that like suits the present moment, he wrote this novel in 1949, Earth Abides, which is all about this, scientist who's like one of the few survivors of a sudden massive epidemic that wipes out 99.99% of everybody. So, it's a very sylvan tale of kind of the end of the Anthropocene, but the way it's written is super interesting. It has this kind of Thoreauvian relationship to the American landscape that I think science fiction kind of rarely touches on. And he was not a career science fiction writer. He wrote another novel which was not as popular or successful. I think the title is just Fire, but the hero is literally a Californian forest fire.
Wow.
And in chapter 1, the fire starts, and then it just starts doing stuff. So if you're Californian and you're reading about massive wildfires, this is one of the few books in which a massive Californian wildfire is actually the protagonist, right? I think characters show up and engage with the wildfire and they're like humans, but none of them are the center of the narrative. Like a non-human actor, a mass disaster is actually the center of the narrative. And I've admired that trick for a long time. I felt like I should do something with that, but I never yet have.
That's outstanding.
That's what impresses me about George R. Stewart. He's kind of exploring areas of narrative where the genre doesn't go.
How about you, Chris?
I would say, one writer that comes to mind is somebody who I think gets a fair bit of recognition, but maybe doesn't get quite the recognition she deserves as a sort of cyberpunk or post-cyberpunk figure, is Malka Older, who I think writes, really smart near future work that deals with issues about the nexus between, like networks and democracy and politics, and this idea of a more authentically participatory future that I couldn't figure out when I tried to do it. And there's one new book I just read that's just out like this week by a writer who is kind of new on the scene and sort of at the edges of it. It's a guy named Robert G. Penner, is a Canadian writer living in the US. And the book is called Strange Labor. And it's kind of like does stylistically a lot of the things that classic cyberpunk did, but in the context of a more apocalyptic kind of road trip novel. Really beautifully done.
There's a question from Brian Sebi in the chat to me, asking about how, given that I wrote Down and Out of the Magic Kingdom, how do I feel about Disney's transformation into a giant, ruthless proprietor of all culture? I think much the way I thought about it back then, which is to love the sin and hate the sinner. That particularly the built environments, which, are either shuttered or should be right now, are remarkable pieces of art, right? Of immersive art that I adore in a way that I think other people probably like VR, which is a medium that I have no real time or energy for. Being in big enclosed built environments that are designed with a lot of thoughtfulness around conveying the emotional beats of a story, even if they're not really structured as a narrative, is a very exciting thing for me. It speaks to me in this very profound aesthetic way. And when I contemplate their ownership of all this property, the anti-monopolist in me is terrified, but the jetpack socialist in me is like, well, once they're under public ownership, think of the mashups we can make, because there'll be no clearances, right? And so, I live 5 minutes from the gates of the Disney Studios here in Burbank. Walt Disney Elementary School is around the corner from my house. It's a company town. And so it's all around us. It's the air I breathe and the water I swim in here. And it's hard not to see the wonder of the art and not to see the problems of the firm.
Can I ask you a question, Cory?
Sure.
That kind of cues up. I was thinking about it reading this remarkable new book of yours, which I can relate to in the way it deals with the issue of how the technologist and the person who embraces the cyberpunk potential of technology can find herself or himself engaging in a series of compromises in life for work or for otherwise that they have to wrestle with. And you wrote that character of Masha in that respect with such tremendous empathy and insight, I thought. And I wondered if you could speak to kind of how you relate to that as a writer and as somebody who's been in a lot of different parts of the tech business about, those really difficult ethical decisions one makes about how you approach the work you're trying to do while it's still taking care of your family and meeting your needs.
Well, I'd say that if there's a naive belief in attack surface, it's that the main line of technologists discover their passion for computers when some combination of writing code that runs perfectly, and then you can give it to someone else and they can run it so that you can project your will around the world. You can make your will manifest in this perfect robot and then give it to other people and it will perform for them as well. And or finding a network and finding people on that network who share your interests and ideas in ways that you thought no one ever could, and who have the words for things that you felt that you never had words for. And then for those people to have found themselves in a corporate environment where their primary mission is to take those powers away from other people, seems to me to be a cleavage line on which we can find solidarity, right? In which we can speak to their morals and ethics. It's, the line that kept coming back to me writing this book was Orwell, if there is hope, it is in the proles, right? Like if we can speak to a workforce, I love the eye roll, Bruce, if we can speak to a workforce that had 20,000 high-paid workers.
He's claiming he's hanging out with the proles, but he never does.
Well, that's true. But 20,000 Googlers walked off the job last year.
And those aren't proles, Cory.
No, they're not, but they're Morlocks, right? And if you can get the Morlocks to stop the machine stops. And
okay,
so,
Google or Eloy, they're not Morlocks. I don't want to step on all your great lines here. Yeah.
All right.
But if I agree with you, I agree with you about like interactive art installations. I mean, Disneyland has got that quality, and I as somebody who hangs out in the Italian art scene, I have to look at a lot of installation art, and I think science fiction writers and science fiction people could derive a lot of benefit from engaging with that particular form of expression because it's very experienced design and it has a world building quality.
That's very true. Yeah, 100%.
You're not merely being sold something. You're like moving into an environment where stuff happens, right? And that's actually a sister art of ours.
the incompleteness of it is a feature and not a bug, right? The
Exactly,
underspecified rides get filled in with your imagination to a depth that you've never had. Jim McDonald once told me that if you ever want to write a scene with a gun in it and you don't want to get shot on by gun people, you say that the gun is modified. And then instead of finding the failings, they will go through mental backflips to figure out what amazing, cool idea you had to modify the gun so it did the thing that it does in your story, and credit you with being really smart about it. And this is also a thing that I think we see in rides like the Haunted Mansion, where it's no one ever got to write a narrative for it. There were like 10 competing stories, and bits and pieces were cherry picked as it was built, and then the writers fill in the narrative with a depth that isn't there.
It has some connection to, you know, science fiction's tradition of shared world anthologies.
Yeah,
it's like, okay,
100%.
We've like built this thing and we've done something, you know, and,
Right.
and
Are there
that we kind of need one of those at this point. Actually, we'd be great if we had some kind of like Cthulhu mythos that was not horrible, but was a kind of new science fiction shared world thing. You know, and I don't think it helps to like get super close to the gadgets. I mean, I think the period for that's kind of over. I would like to see something like, you know, Lord Dunsany. I mean, we need something mythical at this point. And I say that even though I'm not any kind of mystic. It's just the social condition calls out for it.
Are there any good real world or cyber fictional examples of situations in which it's not the Google employees, but like the users that sort of take over and organize and say, we're going to reset the rules? Isn't that kind of what the victory condition is?
I think it's solidarity between the tech workers, the workers for the tech firms. So like the Amazon programmers, the Amazon warehouse workers, and the Amazon customers, right? It's the Amazon without Jeff Bezos is the best Amazon, right? You just eliminate the shareholders, and what's left is this kind of Promethean vision. There's a good little book from Jacobin called Four Futures that digs into this. And also Lee Phillips wrote a book called The People's Republic of Walmart that revisits this as well. It's quite good. I think I'm pretty sure we're only on for an hour, so I'm gonna ask the last question, and then we round it up here. Sam Hansen had a question. He mentions that, or sorry, I don't know Sam's pronouns. They mentioned that Little Brother talks about Bayesian stats, Homeland talks about incompleteness, and asks what it is in attack surface. And in attack surface, I do get close to the gadget. I get close to machine learning and what's something called the adversarial example, which is this idea that maybe in every single machine learning inference engine classifier, there's a blind spot, a lacuna that you can use to give classifiers hallucinations, right? That there's a really highly reliable classifier where if you take like a 64 pixel by 64 pixel thumbnail and say, which of these large images does it correspond to? It's like 98% accurate. But if you change one pixel, there's just one pixel that it's like its Achilles heel. And if you change the color values there, its accuracy plunges to like 11%. And we see this all the time. We see all these weird classifier errors. It's a source of a lot of like hilarious kind of science fiction-y plot stories, but it also implies that anytime you're using machine learning in a way that's adversarial, you have to countenance the possibility that the classifications that are coming in faster than any human being can review them are being completely gamed by the adversary. And it really makes it, and it makes for a very fraught future in which machine learning is more tightly integrated, but this issue, which may not be addressable, is never addressed. So
I'm quite the machine learning fan. I've been trying to write something convincing about it for 5 or 6 years now. Yeah, it's fun, and it's super cyber, and it's kind of a cyber frontier. But you know, it's one of those cyber frontiers where the stakeholders have to pony up $1 billion to be at the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that climate footprint, the carbon footprint of the models is crazy. There's all kinds.
You know, it's about as exciting as Bell Labs.
Yeah.
Back in their glory days, which was exciting.
Yep.
And, yeah, I mean, there was cool stuff going on at Bell Labs, but it's not very hands-on.
you've given me an idea for a story, because all the good stuff at Bell Labs happened after the consent decree that banned them from commercializing, like Unix, where they just had to license it to other people.
Or
And then
discovering the 3-degree microwave radiation in the cosmos. You know, they're doing fantastic astronomy stuff.
Yeah.
They're a monopoly. It's like, let's just point the antenna at the sky. You know?
So Ginny, you're back, and I think that means we're done. Is that right?
Well, if you guys are at a pausing place, I was here to say that works. But
let me say thank you and goodbye, and then we maybe hear from Anderson's as a finale. Is that sound good? So it remains for me to say thank you to Bruce, who got up at 2 a.m. in a house with a newborn in it on a travel day and joined us. Boy, does that mean a lot.
I'll sleep on the plane. It'll be fine.
that famously long haul plane journey from Spain to Italy.
Yeah.
and Chris, thank you very much. Also in a house with a newborn in it, and with many things on your plate, and you were kind enough to actually put a copy of the book in a care package to Bruce, and I really appreciate it. Thank you to the audience for coming. Yeah, there you go. Awesome. Nice. And I there are 3 more of these with 3 more bookstores. They each come with a copy of the book, which you probably don't need because you got one with tonight's. But I've just if you go to that URL that I just pasted into the chat, that's a list of libraries, schools, prisons, halfway houses, classrooms, universities that would like copies. So if you want to come to another one of these, you can put their address down instead of your own, and it'll go to them. There's also a form there if you are one of those institutions you'd like to put your name down. Ginny, thank you very much for joining us and staying late after work. It really means a lot. And thank you to the Anderson family. Little brother wouldn't have been little brother without Anderson. So it really means a lot to me.
Well, those are the amazing success stories that are just a joy to be a part of, and expanding our network here to include Bruce and Christopher. And Cory, that's amazing that you can just send folks to these places to have their books sent there. That's wonderful. And also another example of authors and books doing good in the world and changing the world for better. So thank you all for your time, and thank you everybody for being here. Just as a reminder, if you had a book shipped to your home or to wherever the book is going to be shipped, we'll start working on those tomorrow. We are not algorithms and robots and drones picking packages. We are humans in the basement of the bookstore. So we appreciate your patience as we work on getting those out. And I will just end by, Christopher, we were talking earlier on what cool things are in our area outside Chicago. And then you guys brought up Bell Labs. We do have the Alcatel-Lucent merger happened. And that's, I don't know, about 2 miles from my house right now. So that's where my father-in-law worked. So I guess we do have a little connection to the cool world, Chris, after all. All right. Well, listen, everybody else, we appreciate you sharing your time. Stay well out there. Happy reading, and hope to see you all in person soon as when we can.
Chris and Bruce, give my love to Augie and Yasmina.
Right back at you. Great to see you guys. Thank you so much for getting us together, Cory.
Hasta luego.
All right. Ciao, ciao.
Hasta la vista. All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.